Okay, we're going to be working with Camera Raw, and you may say to yourself, well, what is Camera Raw? Camera Raw is a part of Photoshop, and you can work with JPEGs, RAW camera files, such as a .nef for a Nikon RAW file, or a .crw for a Canon RAW file. A JPEG is a file that is heavily compressed. All digital cameras, including your phone, record in JPEG. Right? I can select a JPEG and go into Camera Raw and work with it. So if you use Lightroom, Camera Raw is basically exactly like the develop portion of Lightroom. It allows you to work in a digital darkroom. So I'm going to come back to this file. First, I'm going to go to, this is a RAW file. What is a RAW file? You guys, are you familiar with the term? Okay. It's a file. What it is all the information that your camera captured on the sensor recorded into a file. There's no sharpening, there's no color balance, there's nothing applied to that file. They're typically very big, and when you bring them into the computer, you need to convert them into a workable kind of format. You can't just double-click on a RAW file and email it, right? You can't just double-click and open it. It needs the digital darkroom for conversion. JPEGs, however, do not, because the processing is done in camera. Excuse me. So when you're doing the RAW, you need to go in to Camera Raw or Lightroom and set things like the white balance, the exposure, the shadows, the highlights, the sharpening, the noise reduction, and that's what we're going to do. If I double-click from Bridge on the CR2, you'll see it takes us directly into Camera Raw. And this is the information it gives us. The f-stop, the shutter speed, the ISO, the lens, our histogram, which is the range of luminosity values. We have our white balance. If you have a JPEG, you have 3 options. If you have a Camera Raw, you have all the options that are available in the camera. Temperature and tint, which you can also use to adjust the color balance, and white balance. You have the exposure, which deals with the midtones. Contrast, which I'm going to say leave alone here because the second tab over has a parametric and point curve, which is just like in Photoshop. You have highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. This is the exposure range here. This is the highlights, and this is the white. And here is the shadows, and here is the black. Clarity increases the midtone contrast between pixels. And then you also have vibrance, which will give a little more oomph to the colors in the photograph that are not the prominent colors. And then saturation. Phil is very disruptive. I just want to say that. The saturation increases all the saturation and the intensity of all the colors. So this is a lot of information. So where do you start? When you take a file into Camera Raw, just treat it like you're in the darkroom. Start at the top. Does the image look too blue, too yellow? You might want to run through some of the presets. So you can see, as shot, temperature slider, auto, brings a lot more yellow into it. If you go through some of the presets, you may say, oh, that's a little too yellow, this may be considered too blue, also too blue. Okay, so I'm going to go to as shot. That is kind of cold. If I go to auto, it will warm it up a great deal, and I can experiment with that with the temperature. I just took some allergy medication, so that's what's happening right here, everybody. Now the tint, I like to look in the whites and see if there are any green tones or magenta tones. There may be a little bit of magenta. I can pull that out. You don't want to go too far green. You can also grab the white balance tool and click in an area you know to be neutral, and it will establish that as your white balance. If I zoom back out, it looks pretty good. The next is exposure, and look at the histogram when I move this slider. It moves the bulk of information over. When I drag it to the right, it brightens it up. I drag it to the left, it darkens it. You know, this is a pretty well exposed image, so not going to have to do too much more than maybe add a little bit of exposure. You can hit P on and off, which is preview, to see how it's working. Again, we're going to leave the contrast alone. Highlights will affect this part of the histogram. So watch what happens in that part of the histogram. And also, in these high areas of high detail here in the water. Zoom up. So you can see that they go from being kind of dingy to being a lot more crisp. This area of the histogram where there are no pixels is called pixel wasteland. And you can safely move the luminosity values of your histogram to the edges. So before I go to the shadows, I'm going to skip to the white and see if I can drag it to the right until I get information at this furthest end. Okay. And that looks pretty good. This is before and this is after. A lot more light and airiness to it. I'm going to go back up to shadows. If I drag it to the right, it will continue to lighten up all of the shadow areas. Not exactly what I want to do. I want to add a little more weight to the shadow areas. And you can see I'm also giving a little more beef to this part of the histogram. Now with the black, I can drag it a little to the left. I'm not going to drag it too far to the left though. P is before and after. I'm going to be a little less generous with that black. Every image is subjective. You're going to do certain things to one image that you would not do to another. And because this is a kind of a seaside, you may not want it to be super high contrast. I'm going to zoom in again. The clarity is kind of like sharpening. However, sharpens all the pixels, and what this does is adjust the mid-tone contrast. Just going to give it maybe 20. Vibrance here isn't going to do too much. It's going to make some of the colors that are not prominently vibrant more vibrant, but in this case, I'm not sure I don't want this to get crazy yellow in here where it begins to look unrealistic, right? Unrealistic. One of the ways I teach photography is that everything looks photographic, right? There are no like crazy blurs, like foamy edges, like bad HDRs, and we'll talk about that. I say just be conservative. Okay, I'm going to do one more thing. I've got my lens hood right there and right there. I'm going to grab the crop. I want to keep the original aspect ratio. The original aspect ratio of this image is not 3 to 4. I believe it's 2 to 3. You can know what that is just by pulling your crop out. I'm going to crop out those very top edges. Hit return, crops it out. And then if I think I've done pretty well, I'm good to go. I can experiment in the next tab over with the tonal quality, increasing the contrast a little, or I can affect certain parts of the histogram by dragging each of these sliders. So if I want the shadows to be open a little bit, and it will pick the part of the histogram that it will affect. For most images, this is enough to get you into the basic digital darkroom. Again, this controls the color temperature, the white balance. This is how you make it lighter or darker. In the midtones, shadows, highlights, whites, and blacks corresponding to the histogram. And clarity gives it a little bit of a punch. Now this is where working with Camera Raw is very cool. When you hit done, and you're in Bridge, you'll see this little icon, and I call it the Death Star. Partially because I think it looks like the Death Star, and partially because I don't know what else it's called. So, the Death Star says, I have been edited in Camera Raw, and it says, I have been cropped. So you still could not send this to someone and have them open it. You would have to double click, which will take you right back into Camera Raw. You would have to save image. We're not going to get there yet, all right? When you're editing in Camera Raw, all we're going to do is hit done. One more reason done is so great when you're learning how to work with photographs. Say you're like, okay, and you hit done. And I say to you, wow, do you think it's a little dark? You know, maybe? If you had done that in Photoshop on a background with an auto adjustment, you would have no way to go back and change it. Now, all you have to do is double click, open it back up, and change it. Camera Raws are editable, and it's a non-destructive workflow.